Welcome back to part 2 of Adara and Ngozi's journey. This is where the real tea is taking place. If you haven't watched part 1, the link is in the description. As always, do tell us where you are watching from in the comments. I love to see how far these amazing stories travel. Enjoy! The motor park at Ojota was chaos incarnate, and Adara stood at the edge of it feeling like she'd been dropped into another planet. The noise was overwhelming, shouting in languages she half understood, horns blaring, music blasting from competing speakers, the smell of exhaust and roasting plantain and human density mixing into something that made her eyes water. She clutched her bag with the jollof rice and the Ankara fabric and the return ticket she'd already bought because she couldn't afford to stay overnight, and she asked 3 different people how to get to Lekki before someone finally pointed her toward a Danfo bus. The ride took an hour, the bus packed so tight she could barely breathe, her face pressed against someone's shoulder while the conductor hung from the door shouting stops. She watched Lagos stream past the window, the wealth growing more obvious with every kilometer, the cars getting newer, the buildings getting taller, the women on the sidewalks wearing clothes that looked like costumes from foreign films. By the time she reached the estate gate, she felt dirty, small, crushingly out of place. The security man looked at her the way you look at something that has wandered into the wrong habitat. Slowly, from her dusty sandals up to her simple wrapper and faded blouse, his eyes doing an inventory that ended in barely concealed contempt. "Who are you looking for?" he asked in English, not even trying to hide his skepticism. Adaora gave him Ngozi's name and the flat number, and he made a show of checking his clipboard, then picking up his phone, then speaking to someone on the other end while looking at her the entire time as if she might bolt or try to steal something. Finally, he hung up and jacked his head toward the gate. "You can go. Building C, 3rd floor." She walked through the estate in a kind of daze, past cars that gleamed in the afternoon sun, past manicured lawns that someone must water every day, past children riding expensive bicycles while their mothers watched from balconies, and all the while her heart was pounding harder because she knew now that something was very wrong. Her sister, the girl she'd pounded fufu for at 4 a.m., the girl she'd sold her mother's earrings for, was living in a place like this, and there was only one way a girl from Umoha with no family money and a small allowance lived in a place like this. The elevator was like nothing she'd ever experienced. Mirrors on every wall, soft music playing from somewhere invisible, buttons that glowed when she pressed them with a shaking finger. She watched herself in the reflection, thin, work-worn, her long silky hair still adorned with the small gold ornament her mother had given her, but everything else about her screaming poor, village, doesn't belong, and she tried to steady her breathing. The elevator moved so smoothly she barely felt it. Just watched the numbers climb. 1, 2, 3. When the doors opened, she stood in a carpeted hallway that smelled like expensive air freshener, and she walked to the door marked 3C with her bag clutched to her chest and her heart somewhere in her throat. She knocked. She heard movement inside. She heard voices, her sister's voice, and then a deeper voice, male, saying something she couldn't make out. Then the door opened and there was Ngozi, standing in a silk robe that probably cost more than Adaora made in 3 months, her hair freshly done in long Brazilian waves, her skin glowing with the kind of moisturizer that comes in jars from South Africa. And behind her, visible through the open door to the living room, was a man old enough to be their father, sitting on a cream leather sofa in a singlet and boxer shorts, watching a flat-screen television the size of a window, his feet propped up on an ottoman, as if he owned not just the furniture, but the air itself. Time did something strange in that moment. It stretched and compressed simultaneously. Adaora saw everything. The marble floors, the air conditioning unit humming quietly in the corner, the expensive paintings on the wall, the bottle of wine on the coffee table, the man glancing over at them with casual indifference before turning back to his program. She saw her sister's face cycle through emotions too quickly to process. Surprise, then fear, then something that hardened into defensiveness. She saw all of it, and she felt something break inside her chest, clean and final, like a bone snapping. "Ada?" Ngozi said, and her voice was wrong, too bright, too false, like she was playing a role. What are you doing here? You didn't tell me you were coming." She didn't invite her in. She stood in the doorway like a barrier, like she was protecting the inside from contamination by the outside. Adara couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. She just held out the bag. The jollof rice, now cold, the Ankara fabric, suddenly pathetic, and watched her sister glance at it with something that looked almost like embarrassment. The words came from somewhere deep, from the same place she'd sold her mother's jewelry, from the same place she'd washed strangers' underwear in the rain, from the place that had kept a notebook of sacrifices and believed it was building something holy. "Ngozi, what is this? What are you doing?" Her voice cracked on the last word. She was not elegant about it. She was just honest. The way you're honest when your heart is breaking in real time and you don't have the energy to pretend otherwise. "That man in there, he's old enough to be Papa. What are you? How can you?" She couldn't finish, couldn't make the words form properly. Behind Ngozi, the man called out, "Baby, who is that?" And Ngozi flinched at the endearment, actually physically flinched. Then something shifted in her face. The fear and shame transformed into something harder, something that looked almost like anger. "Ada, you don't understand. You couldn't understand. It's different here. Things cost money, real money, not what you send." She stopped herself, but the damage was already visible in the air between them. Adaora took a step back, as if she'd been physically pushed. "I work myself to death for you," Adaora said, and her voice was shaking now, all control gone. "I wake up at 4 a.m., I pound fufu until my arms feel like they're breaking. I wash people's dirty clothes. I sold Mama's earrings. I sold her wrapper. I sold everything I had so you could study, so you could have a future. And you're here?" She gestured at the apartment, at the silk robe, at the man on the sofa who was now watching them with mild interest. "You're here doing this? Lying down with some woman's husband? This is what I sacrificed for?" Ngozi's face hardened completely then. She crossed her arms over her chest. That silk robe probably cost what Adara made in 2 months, and let out a short, sharp laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "Sacrifice," she said, and the word dripped with something poisonous. "You think you're some kind of saint, Ada? You think I owe you my whole life because you chose to pound fufu? I didn't ask you to do that. I didn't ask you to play mata." The words hung between them like smoke. Adara felt them land, felt them sink into her chest and settle somewhere near her heart. "Ngozi," she whispered, but her sister wasn't finished. She leaned against the doorframe, silk robe shifting, and looked at her sister with eyes that had learned cruelty in this city of glass and concrete. "You want to know the truth, Ada? You want to know what I think when you send me your little 10,000 naira every month? I think, what exactly is a fufu seller who never finished secondary school going to teach me about the world? What do you know about anything? About Lagos? About what it takes to survive here? You're standing there in your village wrapper, acting like you're better than me. But look at you. Look at your hands. Look at your life." She said it without raising her voice, which somehow made it worse. Each word was precise, calculated, designed to cut. "I'm going to have a degree. I'm going to have a future. And you are going to what? Pound fufu until your Mama Nkechi's age? This is my life now. And you," she looked her sister up and down one more time, "you should go back to Moha. This isn't your world." Adara stood there, holding her bag with the cold jollof rice and the Ankara fabric, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not just heartbreak, something deeper, something like the death of a particular kind of hope. She looked at her sister, this stranger in silk, who had Ngozi's face but not her voice, not her soul. And she realized with terrible clarity that the girl she'd been sacrificing for no longer existed. Maybe she'd never existed the way Adara had imagined her. Maybe she'd been pounding fufu for a dream, for an idea, for a version of her sister that had only ever lived in her own head. She took one more step back, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet, very steady. "You are right, Ngozi. I don't know anything about Lagos. I don't know anything about how to sell myself to old men. I don't know how to look at the person who gave up everything for me and feel nothing." She paused, and something cold and clarifying settled over her like frost.
But I know that Mama and Papa would weep if they could see you now. And I know that I'm done. I'm done carrying you. I'm done breaking my back for someone who thinks I'm beneath her." She set the bag down on the floor at Ngozi's feet, left it there like an offering refused. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator with her head high and her back straight. And she didn't look back even when she heard Ngozi call out, "Ada, wait," in a voice that suddenly sounded very young and very afraid. The door closed. The elevator came. Adara stepped inside and watched the numbers descend. 3, 2, 1. And she realized she was crying only when she saw her reflection in the mirror. She walked through the estate, past the manicured lawns and the expensive cars, through the gate, past the security man who didn't even look at her, onto the Danfo bus packed with people who knew nothing about her and her pain. She sat in that bus as it crawled through Lagos traffic, and she let herself feel it. The rage, the grief, the humiliation, the betrayal. She let it all wash through her like fever. And somewhere between Lagos and Onitsha, as the city gave way to smaller towns and then to villages, and finally to the familiar red dust of Anambra State, something inside her crystallized. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, something harder and colder and infinitely more useful. Determination. She had spent 4 years of her life carrying someone who didn't want to be carried. She had poured herself out like water for someone who thought she was worthless. But she was not worthless. She had strong hands and a strong back and a mind that knew how to turn small money into slightly larger money. She had survived the death of her parents and the burden of raising her sister and 4 years of labor that would have broken someone weaker. She had survived all of that. And now, finally, she was going to survive for herself.
Adora didn't tell Mama Nkechi what happened in Lagos. She returned to Umuoha on a Tuesday evening, walked into the compound with her bag lighter than when she'd left, and when her grandmother asked, "How is Ngozi? Did you see her?" she simply said, "Yes, Mama, she's fine, she's doing well." The old woman looked at her granddaughter's face, really looked, the way only someone who has loved you your entire life can look, and saw something there that made her press her lips together and nod slowly. She didn't ask any more questions. That night, Adora lay on her mat in the corner of the sitting room and stared at the ceiling, listening to Mama Nkechi's soft snoring, listening to the night sounds of Umoha filtering through the window, and she did not cry. She'd done her crying on the bus, and now there was nothing left but a clear, cold certainty. She was 22 years old. She had nothing. No education past secondary school, no husband, no prospects. Just cracked hands and a strong back and 4 years of experience turning cassava into money. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, lying there in the darkness, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. She was no longer carrying anyone. For the first time since her parents died, her life was only hers. The idea came to her 3 days later while she was pounding fufu in the pre-dawn darkness. Her arms moved in their familiar rhythm, and her mind was turning over possibilities the way you turn over soil looking for something that will grow. She'd been selling fufu for 4 years now. She knew every customer by name, knew their preferences, knew when they'd come and what they'd order. She knew she made good fufu, better than most, because she never rushed it, never added too much water, never let it cool before wrapping. She also knew how to make ofe onugbu the way her mother had taught her, with the right balance of bitter and uziza. She knew how to make egusi that didn't separate, jollof rice that had that perfect smoky bottom, pepper soup that could cure a cold or a broken heart, depending on what you needed. She'd been cooking for other people's businesses. The chop house on the main road bought from her 3 times a week. What if she stopped cooking for other people's profits and started cooking for her own? The thought was so obvious she almost laughed. Why had she never considered it before? Because she'd been too busy trying to keep Ngozi in school, trying to stretch every naira towards someone else's future. But that was over now. Her money was hers, her time was hers, her future was hers. She went to the Umuoha Women's Cooperative that same afternoon. She'd been a member for 4 years, never missing her weekly contribution of 200 naira. A discipline that had sometimes meant going without meals, but had earned her something more valuable than food: credibility. Mama Chinyere, The cooperative chairwoman was a large woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for being able to smell a bad investment from 3 villages away. She listened to Adara's proposal, a loan of 250,000 naira to start a proper food business, while fanning herself with a folded newspaper. When Adara finished, Mama Chinyere looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You've been coming here every week for 4 years, rain or shine. You've never missed, never asked for help, never complained. Where is that sister of yours, the one you are working for?" Adara met her eyes steadily. "She's in Lagos, ma, finishing her studies, but I'm not working for her anymore. I'm working for myself now." Something flickered in Mama Chinyere's face. Understanding maybe. Even respect. She nodded once. "Come back on Friday. We'll discuss terms." The loan came through 2 weeks later, 250,000 naira, to be paid back over 18 months with modest interest. It was not a fortune. In Lagos, it was probably what Ngozi's silk robe cost. But in Adaora's hands, which had learned to multiply small things into slightly larger things, it was enough. She rented a small shop on the main road, a former provision store with a low ceiling and walls that had faded to the color of old newspaper. The landlord wanted 6 months' rent up front. She negotiated down to 3 and took it. She spent a week scrubbing that shop until the floor gleamed, until you could eat off any surface, until it smelled like possibility instead of abandonment. She painted the walls herself bright white, because white looked clean, and clean was what people wanted when they bought food. She bought 2 large cooking pots from the market in Onitsha, the kind that could feed 30 people. She bought a used gas cooker from a woman whose restaurant had failed, negotiated hard, got it for half the asking price. She bought plates, spoons, plastic chairs, tables that wobbled slightly but could be fixed. She bought a generator, used, temperamental but functional, because NEPA could not be trusted, and food that went bad was money thrown into a pit. The sign was her final investment. She paid a local artist 5,000 naira to paint it on wood. Ada's kitchen, taste of home, in green and white, the colors of her country, the colors of hope. She hung it herself above the door, standing on a borrowed ladder while Mama Nkechi steadied the bottom, and half the compound came out to watch. When it was up, when she climbed down and stood back to look at it, she felt something swell in her chest that was so big it almost hurt. This was hers, not built on someone else's sacrifice, not meant for someone else's dream. Hers. That night, she sat in her empty shop and did something she hadn't done since the night her parents died. She prayed. Not the desperate prayers of the last 4 years, the prayers that were really just bargaining. Please let there be enough money. Please let Ngozi be okay. Please let this work. This was different. This was gratitude. This was acknowledgement. Mama, Papa, I don't know if you can see me, but I want you to know I'm still here. I'm still fighting, and I'm going to make something of this life you gave me. I promise. She opened on a Monday morning in October with 3 dishes: ofeaku, egusi soup, and white rice. She also had fufu, pounded fresh that morning, and zobo to drink. 5 people came that first day. She knew all of them. They were her regular fufu customers, coming out of loyalty or curiosity or both. She served them herself, moving between the tiny kitchen and the 3 tables, asking if the soup needed more salt, if the fufu was soft enough, watching their faces as they ate. When they paid and left, she counted the money, 3,500 naira. After expenses, ingredients, gas, the plastic plates she'd had to throw away because they cracked, she'd made maybe 800 naira profit. It was less than she'd made selling fufu, but it was a beginning. The next day, 7 people came. The day after that, 12. By the end of the first week, word had spread through Umuaha, the way word spreads in villages, through church announcements and market gossip, and one satisfied customer grabbing another by the sleeve. Have you tried Ada's kitchen? The egusi is just like how my mother used to make it, and she gives you proper portions, not like those places that think you won't notice when they skimp on the meats. The business grew the way good things grow when the right person tends them with the right combination of desperation and skill. By the end of the first month, Adaora had to hire Obiageli, a young girl from the next compound who needed work and didn't mind waking early. By the second month, there was a line at lunchtime. Farmers, teachers, the staff from the local government office, truck drivers who started making Ada's kitchen a regular stop on the Onitsha route. By the third month, she'd paid back her first loan installment early and started saving for a bigger space. Her hands were still rough, still bore the marks of 4 years of hard labor, but now when she looked at them, she saw something different. Not damage, evidence, proof that she had survived what should have broken her. She bought herself new shoes, not because she was being frivolous, but because her feet had carried her this far and deserved something better than the worn-out sandals felled together with wire. She bought fabric to make a new wrapper. She bought a small Nokia phone, her first phone ever, so customers could call ahead with orders. Small things, but each one felt enormous, felt like she was slowly reclaiming pieces of herself that had been sold off or worn away. She was building something, not for anyone else, for herself. And it felt better than anything she'd imagined. While Adaora was rising in Omoaha, Ngozi was learning what it felt like to fall. It started with the messages. The first one came on a Tuesday morning while she was in a lecture on constitutional law, her phone buzzing in her bag with a number she didn't recognize. "I know about you and Chief Emeka. Leave my husband alone or you will regret it." She deleted it immediately, told herself it was a wrong number, a confused woman, nothing to do with her. But the messages kept coming. Different numbers, same message, variations on the theme. Husband snatcher, small girl with no shame, your mother didn't raise you well. Then came the calls. Late at night, early morning, a woman's voice spitting curses in Yoruba and English, promising consequences, promising disgrace. Ngozi blocked the numbers, but they kept multiplying, like cutting off one head of a hydra and watching 7 more grow back. She told Chief Emeka about them and he'd waved his hand dismissively, said, "Don't mind them. These women, they're just jealous. Ignore them." Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one being called a whore by strangers. He wasn't the one whose phone had become a weapon that wounded you every time it buzzed. Then came the afternoon when 3 women showed up at the estate gates. Ngozi heard them before she saw them. A commotion at the security post. Voices raised, one woman's voice cutting through everything else like a knife. "Where is she? Where is the small girl who thinks she can take my husband? Let her come down here. Let her come and face me." Ngozi stood at her window on the 3rd floor and looked down to see them. 3 women, all older than her, all wearing the particular fury of wives who've had enough. The security guard was trying to calm them, but they were not here to be calmed. Neighbors came out onto their balconies. Someone was filming with their phone. The woman who was shouting, Chief's wife, Ngozi realized with a sick lurch in her stomach, was pointing up at the building, at Ngozi's window, describing in vivid detail what kind of girl lived there and what she did for money. Ngozi stepped back from the window, her heart hammering, and she called Chief Emeka's number with shaking hands. It rang and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She sent a text. "Your wife is here. There are 3 of them. Please come. Please help." He never replied. Eventually, the security guard convinced the women to leave, but the damage was done. Every neighbor in that estate now knew what she was. The next day, when she went to the gate, the security man looked at her with undisguised contempt. Within a week, 2 of the estate's wives had cornered her at the communal poll and told her, politely but firmly, that girls like you were not welcome there anymore. Her studies had been unraveling for months, but Ngozi had been too distracted to notice how far she'd fallen until it was too late. She'd missed too many lectures, traveling with Chief Emeka to Abuja for a business meeting that was really just a weekend in a hotel, staying up too late at clubs, sleeping through morning classes because she was exhausted from maintaining the performance of being the kind of girl a man like Chief Emeka wanted. She'd submitted assignments that were half done, copied from classmates, thrown together the night before with the kind of carelessness that only comes when something else seems more important. Her lecturers had noticed. Dr. Okonkwo, who taught commercial law, had pulled her aside after class one day and said quietly, "Miss Okafor, you were one of my best students first year. What happened to you?" She hadn't known how to answer. What could she say? I chose an easier path and it destroyed me? She'd mumbled something about personal issues and family problems, and he'd looked at her with a sadness that was worse than anger. You are going to fail if you don't change something, and I don't think you understand yet how permanent failure is. When her final results came, delivered via email on a Tuesday afternoon, Ngozi sat in the Lekki apartment that no longer felt like safety and stared at the screen until the words stopped making sense. Third-class honors. Barely passed. The kind of degree that employers looked at and quietly moved your application to the bottom of the pile. She'd worked so hard to get into university, studied until her eyes burned, passed her WAEC with grades that made her teachers proud, sacrificed her sister's entire life to be here, and she'd walked out with a piece of paper that was essentially worthless. She thought about Adaora in that moment, thought about her sister pounding fufu at 4 a.m., thought about the cracked hands and the soul jewelry, and the 4 years of killing herself slowly, and Ngozi felt something break inside her that made her double over on the expensive leather sofa and sob until she couldn't breathe. What have I done? What have I done? But it was too late for that question. The damage was permanent. The degree was printed. Her transcript was finalized. There was no going back. Chief Emeka's interest evaporated with the same calculated precision with which it had appeared. There was no dramatic breakup, no final confrontation. He simply became unavailable. Calls went to voicemail, texts went unanswered. The credit alerts stopped appearing. When she finally reached him after a week of trying, he was brief, almost bored. Ngozi, I'm very busy these days. My wife is... We're trying to work on things. I think it's best if we take a break. A break? As if this was a relationship that could be paused and resumed. As if she hadn't organized her entire life around him. But what about the rent? The lease is up next month. What about... She heard him sigh on the other end. I'll send someone to sort out the apartment. You'll need to move out by the end of the month. He hung up before she could respond. Just like that. 4 months of being his baby, of trips to nice restaurants, of clothes and phones and the illusion of being cared for. And it ended with a 30-second phone call and a dial tone. She sat in the apartment, his apartment, she realized now, never hers, and looked around at all the things that would disappear when she left. The television, the furniture, the kitchen appliances, the air conditioning. None of it had ever belonged to her. She'd just been borrowing it, the way you borrow someone's umbrella in the rain. And now the rain was over and the umbrella was being taken back, and she was about to discover what it felt like to be wet. She sent out her CV to 20 companies in Lagos, careful to format it properly, to emphasize her extracurricular activities and soft skills rather than the grades that would disqualify her immediately. 3 companies replied, 2 with form rejections that didn't even bother to personalize her name, 1 with an invitation to interview. She went to that interview in her best clothes, practiced her answers, smiled at the right moments, tried to project confidence and competence. The interviewer, a woman about Adara's age, Ngozi realized with a sharp pang, looked at her transcript and said, I see you had a 3rd class. Can you explain what happened? And Ngozi, who'd prepared an answer about personal challenges and family difficulties, found that when she opened her mouth, nothing came out but the truth. I made bad choices. I got distracted. I thought other things were more important than my education. The woman had nodded slowly and said, I appreciate your honesty. Unfortunately, we're looking for candidates with stronger academic records. Ngozi left that office and walked to the bus stop with the particular numbness of someone who's just understood that certain mistakes follow you forever. She tried 9 more companies. The rejections came faster each time. By the end of her 2nd month job hunting in Lagos, she'd spent almost all her remaining money on transport and printing CVs, and she'd gotten exactly nowhere. The city that had once seemed to promise everything was now showing her its other face, the face it shows people who've run out of use, the face that says, you don't belong here anymore. She lasted 3 more weeks in Lagos, sleeping on her coursemate Amarachi's floor, trying to find work as a shop assistant or waitress or anything that would pay rent. But even those jobs wanted references, wanted someone to vouch for you, wanted proof that you wouldn't steal or disappear. She had nothing. No family in Lagos, no network, no godfather to make a phone call, just a 3rd-class degree and a growing awareness that she'd burned every bridge that might have carried her to something better.
The morning she packed her small box, the same box she'd arrived with 5 years ago, now containing fewer clothes than before because she'd sold most of them to eat, Amarachi hugged her and said, "I'm sorry, Ngozi. I wish I could help more." And Ngozi had hugged her back and said, "It's okay. You've already helped. You are a good friend." She meant it. Amarachi had been kind when she didn't have to be. On the bus back to Anambra State, watching Lagos shrink in the rear window, Ngozi finally let herself think the thought she'd been avoiding for months. She had to go back to Umuoha. Back to the village she'd left with such triumph, back to face the sister whose heart she'd broken, back to the grandmother who would be kind, but whose kindness would hurt more than anger, back to admit that she had failed at everything. The bus rolled through the familiar landscape, the red dust, the palm trees, the small towns that all looked like Umuoha's cousins, and Ngozi cried quietly into her hands, trying not to let the other passengers see, trying to prepare herself for what came next. The bus from Lagos to Onitsha took 7 hours, and Ngozi sat in the back with her box on her lap and the window that wouldn't close properly, letting harmattan dust settle on her skin like judgment. She watched the city disappear behind her. The third mainland bridge, the lagoon that had once looked like possibilities stretched out in water, the skyline that had made her feel like she was arriving at the center of the universe. And she understood now, with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass, that she had never arrived anywhere. She had only been passing through, mistaking temporary shelter for a foundation, mistaking a man's money for her own worth, mistaking the appearance of success for the actual substance of it. She was 24 years old and returning to the village she had left with ululation and pride, and she had nothing to show for 5 years, except a degree that meant less than the paper it was printed on, and the kind of shame that lives in your bones. The other passengers on the bus were normal people, a woman with a baby, some traders with goods from Lagos market, a young man in a suit who looked like he was going home for a funeral. They had their own problems, their own stories. None of them knew that the girl in the back with the small box was someone who had thrown away everything that mattered. She was grateful for that anonymity. It was the last kindness the world would offer her before she had to face Umuoha. She arrived in Onitsha at dusk, when the sky was bleeding orange and purple and the air smelled like smoke from 1,000 evening fires. She took a taxi to Moha. Couldn't afford it really, but couldn't bear the thought of walking through the village in daylight where everyone would see her. As she asked the driver to stop at the edge of the compound, rather than pulling all the way in. She paid him with some of her last money and stood there for a long moment, looking at Mama Nkechi's house. It looked smaller than she remembered, more weathered, the zinc roof showing rust spots that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But there was smoke rising from the back, which meant her grandmother was cooking, which meant life had continued here in her absence the way life always continues whether you're part of it or not. She picked up her box and walked through the compound gate, and before she'd taken 3 steps, Mama Nkechi appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her wrapper. The old woman looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, taking in the expensive clothes that were starting to look worn, the Brazilian hair that needed maintenance, the thin frame that spoke of meals skipped and stress carried, and she opened her arms without saying a word. Ngozi dropped her box and ran to her grandmother and collapsed into that embrace, and she cried the way you cry when you've been holding something in for so long it's become poisonous. Mama Nkechi just held her and made soft shushing sounds and didn't ask questions because some things don't need to be explained. The tears explained themselves. That night, lying on a mat in the corner of the sitting room, the same spot where Adaura used to sleep, Ngozi realized with another sharp pain in her chest. She listened to her grandmother's soft snoring and tried to prepare herself for tomorrow, for seeing Umuoha in daylight, for the questions, the stares, the gossip that would spread through the village like water through cracked earth. Ngozi is back. But where is the job? Where is the success? What happened to the girl who was supposed to make everyone proud? She tried to sleep but couldn't, her mind turning over possibilities, rehearsing conversations, imagining the moment when she would have to see Adaura, her sister, the person she had destroyed with casual cruelty, because Lagos had taught her that cruelty was just another form of sophistication. What would she even say? I'm sorry seemed too small for the size of what she'd done. I was wrong seemed too obvious. "Please forgive me" seemed like something she had no right to ask for. She lay there in the darkness and realized that there were some things you broke that couldn't be fixed with words. Some bridges you burned that left you stranded forever on the wrong side of the river.
She heard about Ada's kitchen the next morning from a neighbor's child, a little girl who came by to greet Mama Nkechi and mentioned casually, "Mama, are you going to Sister Ada's restaurant today? My mother says she's making oha soup and it's always finished by noon." Ngozi had been sweeping the compound, trying to make herself useful, trying to earn her place in a space that no longer felt like home. She stopped mid-sweep and looked at the child. "Restaurant?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Eda's kitchen on the main road. It's always full of people. My father eats there every day now. He says it's better than my mother's cooking, but don't tell her I said that." She giggled and ran off, leaving Ngozi standing there with a broom in her hands and a feeling in her stomach like something had just shifted, like the ground beneath her feet had turned to water. A restaurant. Adara had a restaurant. Her sister, the fufu seller, the girl with cracked hands and no education past secondary school, the girl Ngozi had dismissed with such spectacular cruelty, had built something. While Ngozi was failing out of university and losing herself in silk robes and old men's beds, Adara had been building, creating, becoming someone. She walked to the main road that afternoon, telling herself she was just going to look, just going to see what this restaurant was, not to confront anyone or ask for anything, just to see. The walk from Mama Nkechi's compound took 15 minutes, past the primary school where they'd both studied, past the church where their parents' funeral had been held, past the junction where Adara used to sell fufu from a wooden crate. And there, where the old provision store used to be, was something that made Ngozi stop walking and just stare. Ada's kitchen, taste of home, the sign said in green and white. And beneath it was a restaurant that was clearly thriving. The space had been expanded somehow. It took up 2 former shops now, with a proper entrance and windows that actually had glass in them, and a generator humming outside. There were tables on the porch, all of them occupied, people eating and laughing and calling out orders. Through the open door, she could see more tables inside, all full, and she could see Adara moving between them with the kind of efficient grace that comes from doing something well 1,000 times. Her sister was wearing a nice wrapper and blouse, not expensive but clean and pressed and professional. Her hair was still long and silky, still adorned with those small gold ornaments, but everything else about her had changed. She looked solid, grounded, like a person who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Ngozi stood across the road and watched through a gap in the crowd, and she felt something crack open in her chest that was bigger than shame, bigger than regret. It was recognition. She had spent 5 years in Lagos learning how to take from people, to take their money, their status, their illusion of power, while telling herself she was being smart, being strategic, being a survivor. And here was her sister, who actually survived, who took the worst thing life could throw at her and transformed it into something real and standing, who built a business with cracked hands and a secondary school education, while Ngozi was failing out of university and losing herself in silk robes and old men's beds. The contrast was so stark it felt like violence. She watched as 2 young girls, employees Ngozi realized, brought out plates of food, as Adara stopped at a table to ask if everything was okay, as customers called out to her with the kind of easy familiarity that speaks to regular patronage and genuine respect. This was what success looked like. Not the Lekki apartment with borrowed furniture and a man who owned you. This. Something you built yourself, with your own hands, that nobody could take away because it was actually yours. She didn't plan to go in. She was just going to look and then leave. Maybe come back another day when she'd figured out what to say, how to approach this. But then a truck pulled up and blocked her view. And when it moved again, Adeora was standing on the porch looking directly at her across the road. Their eyes met, and the world around them, the noise of the restaurant, the traffic, the people walking past, seemed to fall away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ngozi did the only thing she could think to do. She crossed the road. She walked slowly, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, She could see the changes even more clearly. Adeora's hands were still rough, would probably always be rough, but there was something in her face that Ngozi had never seen before. Confidence. Not the borrowed kind, not the kind that comes from wearing expensive clothes or being seen with the right people. The kind that comes from knowing you've survived everything that tried to kill you. Ada, Ngozi said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, almost childlike. She cleared her throat and tried again. Can we talk? Adeora looked at her for a long moment, and Ngozi couldn't read her expression. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was something more complicated, something that held years of pain and work and transformation. Finally, Adeora glanced back at the restaurant, still full, still busy, and said something to one of the girls. Then she came down the steps and gestured to a bench at the side of the building, away from the customers, away from watching eyes. They sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Ngozi looked down at her hands, soft hands now, the kind of hands that hadn't done real work in years, and tried to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses. I came back, she started, which was obvious and stupid, but it was all she had. Everything in Lagos fell apart. I failed my degree, 3rd class. I couldn't get a job. The man I was, he left. His wife found out, and everything just... She stopped because she could hear herself making it sound like a series of things that happened to her, like she was a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destruction. She took a breath and tried again. Ada, I was wrong about everything. What I said to you that day, when you came to the apartment, it was the worst thing I've ever done, worse than anything that happened after. I looked at you, at the person who gave up everything for me, and I was cruel. I was so cruel. Her voice broke on the last word. I don't know what Lagos did to me. I don't know how I became that person, but I did. And I hurt you, and I can't take it back. I can't fix it. I needed you to know that I understand now what you did for me, what you
Adeora
sacrificed,
sat
what
very
I threw
still,
away.
her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but very clear. When I left Lagos that day, when you closed the door in my face, I cried for 3 hours on the bus home. I cried until I thought I might vomit. And then I stopped crying, and I realized something. She turned to look at Ngozi directly. I realized that I had spent 4 years building a person who didn't exist. I had this idea of you, this smart, good girl who just needed help, who would use the opportunity I was giving her to become something beautiful. But that person was only in my head. The real you? I didn't even know who the real you was. Maybe you didn't either. I didn't, Ngozi whispered. I got lost. I let everything turn me into someone I don't even recognize. And now? Adeora asked. Who are you now? Ngozi opened her mouth to answer and found that she didn't know. She'd been so many people in Lagos, the university student, the kept woman, the girl with the silk robe, the failure returning home in shame. But stripped of all those costumes, sitting on a bench outside her sister's restaurant, who was she actually? I don't know, she admitted. I'm just someone who made terrible mistakes and hurt the one person who loved me most. I'm someone who needs to figure out how to live with that. Adeora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I forgive you. The words hung in the air between them, and Ngozi felt her eyes fill with tears. I forgive you because holding on to anger was killing me, and I decided I didn't want to die that way. But Ngozi, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was. It doesn't mean I'm going to take care of you or carry you or sacrifice myself for you again. Those days are over. I have a business now. I have employees who depend on me. I have loan payments and rent and responsibilities. I have a life that I built for myself, and I'm not going to destroy it to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. I'm not asking you to, Ngozi said quickly. I'm not asking for money or help or... Good, Adeora interrupted, but her voice was gentle. Because what I'm willing to offer you now is different. You can work for me if you want. I need someone to help with the morning prep, peeling vegetables, washing dishes, cleaning the restaurant after we close. The pay is small, 3,000 naira a week to start. You'd have to wake up at 5 a.m., your hands will get rough, your back will hurt, you'll smell like palm oil and onions. It's the same kind of work I've been doing for 6 years. She paused, looking at her sister with an expression that was almost kind, but also unflinchingly honest. Or, you can do something else, find another path. I don't know what that is, but whatever you choose, you have to do it yourself. I'm not carrying you anymore. I love you, Ngozi. I will always love you, but I'm not ready to accommodate you the way I used to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. First, I need to see who you become when you have to stand on your own feet, when you have to build something instead of destroying it or taking it from someone else. Show me that person. Then maybe we can start being sisters again, real sisters, not the kind where one of us does all the giving and the other does all the taking. Ngozi sat with those words, feeling their weight, understanding that this was not a door opening, but rather a door being held slightly ajar, not slammed shut, but not wide open either, just open enough to see what might be possible, but only if she was willing to do the work to reach it. She looked at her sister, at this woman who had survived so much and emerged stronger, who had every right to turn her away and instead was offering her a chance, a small one, conditional and fragile, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief exactly, something more complicated, something like the first painful step towards becoming a person she could respect. "Can I start tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Adaora looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something, sincerity maybe, or determination, or just the smallest indication that this time might be different. Finally, she nodded. 5 a.m. Don't be late. I won't wait for you. She stood up, smoothed her wrapper, and looked down at her sister one more time. And Ngozi, welcome home. The real home, not the fantasy one where everything is easy. The one where you have to work for every single thing you get. Then she turned and walked back to her restaurant, back to her customers, back to the life that she had built from nothing. And Ngozi sat there on the bench, watching her go, watching the door close, not with cruelty this time, but with something that felt almost like hope. Well, that's the end for this amazing story. I hope you enjoyed it. Have you ever sacrificed anything for someone else and they took it for granted? What would you have done if you were Ada? Do let us know in the comments. See you on the next one.